Let's work on this intuitive watercolor painting in real time and talk about the process behind the painting, why watercolor painting has been my go-to lately when I've been busy and overwhelmed, and I talk about how I had no idea at the time of painting this that it was going to be a memorial painting for my 15-year-old emotional support Chihuahua who passed away a few days after finishing this painting. So when I started this painting, I had my Zoe sitting right next to me. All I really had in my head was an arch doorway. That was all I really wanted to start with, and then I wanted to go from there using the watercolor crayons. So I start with this doorway, and I'm just kind of slowly building an idea in my head, and I think at about this point here, I start to think about creating a safe space. And a safe space was a theme in a lot of my therapy sessions for the week. I had been talking to clients about creating safe spaces both within our bodies and minds and nervous systems, and then also creating safe spaces in our external world to allow for healing. And so this was kind of where I was going in creating these first couple of steps. The watercolor crayons are a fun way to invite in the inner child to the watercolor process. I like the way that it feels working with them because they're larger and they just kind of feel like those giant crayons that you used when you were a kid. And I think allowing the inner child into the creative process, even if hearing that word gives you the ick, because I understand that for a lot of people, the concept of the inner child feels woo-woo or feels soft or feels not like something they relate to. If we can just imagine our inner kid in the most literal sense, rather than trying to make it some fluffy, self-helpy kind of thing, and just say, like, what would it be like if your actual 7 or 8 or 9-year-old self was sitting with you doing this? And what would they be thinking? What would they be feeling? What would they like to use for materials? How would they use those materials? It can really allow for a bit of a loosening up in the intuitive process. When you use the crayons, you just basically scribble or draw where you want to draw with them, and you use the water to activate the pigment and move it around, just like you do with a watercolor. So you can manipulate it and have fun with it. The reason I like to bring in other materials with these intuitive watercolors is that it, again, opens up a different kind of side of my brain when I'm working with it. So if I'm working with watercolor paint, there's just kind of a different feeling than when I'm working with crayon or I'm working with pencil, and I like layering the processes together to create different compositions. I think sometimes when I stick to just the watercolor, my compositions tend to be a little bit more rigid, and when I invite in something else like the crayons or the pencils, it tends to loosen me up. I don't know if that makes sense. And I've been having a lot of fun experimenting with wet on wet techniques with watercolor, as well as layering it after it dries. I do think that watercolor has a lot more of an intuitive nature than a lot of artists realize, because I think for me, and this is just my personal opinion as a self-taught, relatively novice artist, I feel like watercolor has always seemed to me to be more of a rigid medium. My mother-in-law is a watercolor painter, and her paintings are so realistic, and she spends so much time slowly and intricately working on these details, and I think that is so beautiful. But my process has always been a bit more messy, a bit more loose, and the more rigid process tends to really activate my perfectionist and makes me feel a bit more uncomfortable in my process. And so I think allowing myself to start to loosen up the watercolor paintings by not sticking with the rules, quote unquote, of watercolor painting and allowing in some other mediums or some alternative techniques, it's really helped me loosen up the idea of what watercolor can be. So if you watched my last long form video, you saw that I love this technique of creating like a solid wet line of watercolor and then kind of blending it out. I've been really enjoying creating just compositions and feelings with that technique. I don't know why, but it feels really good and therapeutic to practice, and it's allowing me to open up some different things with my watercolor compositions that I previously wasn't accessing when I was kind of just slathering on the paint in one-dimensional layer. You see me here really getting into using the watercolor crayons. I had a lot of fun creating these lines, and I wasn't even sure. I'm like, oh my God, is this turning into like a jail cell? Like, I didn't love the vertical lines, and so I was like, wait, tiles, or like, like tiles on a wall, a tile wall. But then I was like, it feels a little clinical and it feels a little cold. So I kind of start to think more warm as I am moving. And I think, ooh, what about if they were those like frosty glass tiles that you can kind of, they look almost like big ice cubes and you can kind of see the light through them, but you kind of can't. And so that's where I started to go with the blue and bringing that kind of light icy blue into the yellow. As I'm creating this room, and at this point it's still a room, I am thinking of safe spaces, and my therapy sessions for the week really focused on safety in my clients' worlds and what that looks like and what it's looked like historically for them, because the idea of what safe space looks like really can evolve or even degrade over time depending on what you go through and depending on how life is thrown at you. So for me, a cold or clinical space or a small room is not going to feel safe. It's going to feel suffocating. It's going to feel like I want to get out of that room. And so I thought it was interesting how this painting started as more of this kind of smaller confined space with this portal door kind of, to me, I think from my perspective, especially as I'm sitting here doing this voiceover, I am realizing that for me, I think the door, I'm walking out of the door. I'm in a space and I'm walking out into a space. So if I am looking at it from my perspective, I'm walking into that arch and walking out into some expanse. And so for me to start with this kind of cold clinical space, which is like the antithesis of safety for me, and then it evolves into this kind of escaping into the outdoors space, escaping to somewhere more beautiful, maybe somewhere magical, while also creating more beauty in the path to getting it there. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as I get into the greenery and things that I start to add into the painting later on. For now, I think just knowing that the intuitive process is really about allowing what's present within you to really speak to the painting. And what was present within me, I think I started painting this only an hour after a day of sessions with clients that really focused on safety and safe spaces. And I realized I hadn't really thought about my own safe space. And so I think that's where that arch doorway really comes in, and this idea of moving from one space to another, or to moving to a safer space, I guess was kind of where my head was. These little tile blocks became tiny experiments with that fade technique that I've been working on, and it helped create that translucent feeling. I was trying to create dimensionality by putting heavy pigment in the corner of each block and pulling it out with clean water, and the yellow creates this kind of light effect. So I started to realize at these moments within the painting process that it was an outdoor space, that I was in an outdoor courtyard rather than a clinical room. And the parts that I cut out of this, so I know a couple of my comments on my last long form videos were saying that they'd love to see the full process. And so I will do a fully uncut video if you want, where I don't edit anything out of it other than like times where I'm blocking the view or times where I'm not in the frame painting. But I think that for now, while I'm doing these more expressive videos, I am going to cut out a little bit of the hesitations because they would be really, really long otherwise. And I think the full painting process for this video, I know the full painting process for this video, because the number was super special and makes it even more special to how this all ends, was 55 minutes and 55 seconds. So this full painting took me 55 minutes and 55 seconds, and I've edited down to 37 minutes and 34 seconds at this moment. So the minutes that I cut out were the hesitations, the times maybe where I picked up my brush for a long period of time. I did try to show more of my brush being picked up in this video than I have in others, but I really like editing them down so that they don't feel so drawn out. There was a comment I got on one of my long form videos last week where a person had mentioned that they felt like if they used their painting process as a therapeutic process, that they would feel like there was something wrong with them and they would rather just paint and not think about those things. And I can understand that. I can understand just wanting to paint to get away from thinking about your emotions and not wanting to create meaning out of everything you paint and not wanting everything to have some feeling behind it. But that's the antithesis of the work that I do with painting. And so I think that if that's your take, then that's great and that's beautiful. But I think to come onto a video where the person is talking about how therapeutic this process has been, both for their clients in therapy and also them, and to say, hey, this makes me feel like there's something wrong with me if I do it this way, might invalidate someone else's experience and be like, wait, is there something wrong with me then? Because I find this really helpful. And there is nothing wrong with using your process to process emotion. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean you're broken. And if you use your process to get away from emotion, that doesn't mean that you're broken or emotions are being inaccurately, processed. You don't have to process your emotions through art. If you're processing your emotions elsewhere, if you're utilizing healthy coping skills, like it doesn't have to equate to your art making. But for me and for my clients, the art making process becomes a second form of communication. It helps you create what might be hard to communicate via words, via images or via textures or shapes. And for some people, it can be really powerful to take something abstract or loosely abstract or, surreal and say, this represents what's inside of me, or this represents something about my world, or, how I'm feeling. And so for me, it is one of the most powerful methods of processing and communication of what is inside. And even if like this piece, it all slowly came to me. And that's the intuitive process, is saying, okay, I see an arch and I'm thinking of safe spaces. And that evolved into this. I pulled in this awesome stencil here. I honestly, as I'm recording this, I don't remember where I got this stencil. I don't think I got it online. I think this is one of those ones that I found randomly on a day when I went to a craft store, but I will look and I will try to link it if I can find it. But I found a lot of different uses for it. And so I went from this indoor kind of feeling to this outdoor feeling. And I had this idea of a stone pathway, and this stencil came to mind. And so I went and grabbed this stencil. I didn't originally have it with me. It was just kind of one of those things where I was like, oh, I know the perfect thing. And I wanted to create the idea of a stone pathway. And I was possibly, and I still might possibly add to this piece, especially now that it has such significant meaning. But I initially had thought that maybe this yellow color would be the underpainting of what the color of the stone would become. So it kind of had this warm glowing feeling under the stone, but I didn't end up really going into those layers. And you'll see kind of what I end up doing to bring the glowing feeling into it, because I just wanted to have this done in one sitting. And I think it's important to note that during this process, I wasn't thinking about my emotions or feelings or safe spaces the entire time. It was just the theme behind where I was headed. Sometimes, yes, I am thinking about my emotions during the whole painting. Sometimes I'm crying during the painting. Sometimes I'm mad during the painting, But for this one, I really was just trying to guide myself using what had been recently present. And so it doesn't have to be this, I'm going to sit down and process my pain. I'm going to sit down and process my sadness. It can genuinely just be, I'm seeing an arch, and recently someone talked to me about, safe spaces. And so it just starts to build itself, and the foundation is just the first steps that you make and the confidence that you have in your ability to keep going and not give up, even though you might feel like what you're creating isn't what you wanted to create or what you thought you were going to create. Just allow yourself to push through those parts where you're like, nope, this isn't working, or nope, I don't like this, because there are so many moments here. I mean, this entire time, I'm like, I have no idea what this is, and I have no idea where this is going. The only reason I kept going is because I've started to really learn that layers bring the piece to life. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm layering, and I'm working on just slowly letting the piece tell me where it wants to go. And this piece wants to go outside. So we bring in some green, and this wet on wet technique again is coming into my favor because the green is bleeding into the wet yellow, and it kind of looks to me like moss or grass or something kind of growing into the path. And I'm also blending the green a little bit up into the blue glass and into the tile or whatever that wall is. It could also be brick. It could be stone. At this point, I'm starting to kind of see it more as maybe stone rather than those glass see-through ice-looking tiles. But again, it's what you see in the moment, and it's what the viewer sees in the moment. It doesn't have to be anything too literal. And so this is where I'm seeing at this moment the surreal part of this coming into play, and thinking, okay, like we don't have to get so rigid with it being a literal space, but also if it was a space, what energy or feelings might be present here. And sunlight was where I went from the greenery. And I wanted there to be this feeling of this sunrise, sunset, dawn, dusk, whatever you want to kind of, however you want to place it, but feeling of wherever this was leading to, there was this glow, there was this light. And here in Massachusetts, it's getting really cold. The days are really short now. It's getting dark almost at like 4:30-ish, maybe even close to 4. It starts to feel really dark. And so this time of year is just the breeding ground for seasonal depression and sadness. And for me, I have struggled with seasonal depression. And well, let's be real, I've struggled with depression my whole life. It's not necessarily seasonal. It just gets worse in the winter. So I think for me in this moment, that safe space, it's warm, it's full of light, it's full of sunshine. And I wanted that to be depicted here so that that outdoor feeling started to come in and it started to feel less cold, less clinical. Using that wet on wet, I'm bringing in the orange to the yellow while adding some water to the yellow. So I basically went in and I did a wash of yellow that I kept really wet and really pigmented. And then I went in with a heavy line of that orange, and then used the clean water in the yellow to kind of bleed that yellow into the orange, and the orange kind of starts to bleed into the white space above it, and it created this kind of blast of light feeling. And you can see that my technical ability to explain this process is limited at times, and so that's the difference between me and someone who is technically trained in watercolor, but hopefully you understand what the heck I'm saying. And if something ever isn't making sense, please feel free to comment, to ask questions. I really would love to engage as much as possible in the comments. I don't get to answer my comments as quickly or as efficiently as I want to because I am in private practice most of the day, most days. But when I do see these comments, I read every single one of them. I talk about every single one of them. They truly, truly are boosting me in so many ways. The last couple of videos have done pretty well, and it's making me really happy to build a community here, and knowing that these videos are hitting and that some people who have been painting their whole lives haven't heard these perspectives. And so for me, that is everything. So again, at this moment, I'm still not exactly sure where I'm headed with this. And I just kind of sit for a bit between each new thing that I add and try to think, okay, what is this? Where am I going? What is it telling me? What am I feeling? And I try my absolute hardest to not give up or give in to the temptation to say, this is ridiculous. I don't know what the hell I'm painting. I'm done. That commitment to finishing the painting is so huge. Finishing it no matter what will really, really, really challenge you in the way that you need to grow. So I'm adding some more depth to the door here. Again, I don't really have a lot of rhyme or reason other than just wanting it to feel like I'm walking into or actually out of a space, but I wanted there to maybe be the illusion that there is a figure or something beyond into that space. And so I start to kind of build a bit of dimensionality into the arch, and I wanted the pink to glow a little bit, that feeling to kind of spread out into this pathway that we're in, this walled pathway, this courtyard. And so I start to pull some of that pink out into the tiles or stone or whatever this is here. So to give that illusion that the light from the pink archway is being reflected off of these walls, drawing us into wherever it is that we're going. And you see that my paper does a lot of moving. I think that I've seen some artists who tape their paper down, and I think there's a lot of benefit to taping your paper down, especially if you want those crisp borders. But I also really like to move my painting. And so if I do tape my paper down, I like to have it on like a board or something that I know that I can pick up and move around, because allowing the colors and the water to bleed into itself can really create some really interesting effects. So I went in with a bit of purple here, and now I'm starting to see this illusion of maybe something being in this space, maybe a figure or a person being in this space. And there is a goal in my future to start getting into more figurative work and getting into more gestural, loose figures. Yeah. And so this is me trying to very loosely get into that part of my journey. But I backed away a little bit at this point because I was like, I don't want to get too caught up in trying to create a figure and then get distracted with the direction of where this painting is going. So I liked this kind of glowy yellow purple that I added to the middle, and I was really, really happy at this point. I'm like, ooh, I'm starting to see it. I'm starting to understand where I'm going with this. And so I just am playing at this point with the wet on wet. And I think that at this point, that yellow at the end was like, okay, here we are. There's my figure. There's this kind of illusion of something or someone being where we're going. And so we're not going to be alone where we're going. So loneliness comes in. And you see how quickly I jump. I'm able to jump in this process from where I'm starting with the safe space to now being in a safe space that is not inside but outside, and then also going into this outside where there's someone else waiting for you. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of artists struggle with loneliness, right? I think we tend to use art as a way to build connection. And I think, well, let's be real. I mean, people in general struggle with loneliness. The loneliness epidemic that is happening, especially since COVID and just since a lot of things have been going on in our government here in the United States and everything else, and just in the world. I mean, this is definitely not isolated to us here, but this idea of loneliness and connection and wanting to be connected to something, maybe even something bigger than ourselves, And so I am not a religious person, but I do believe in something beyond, whatever that is. I identify a bit more as agnostic, with a strong leaning towards Eastern beliefs and Eastern ideas and ideologies. But anyways, we can talk about that another time. I think that for me, having this means of connection through art allows me to tap into that loneliness and that sadness or whatever it is that I'm feeling, and that joy too, that joy. And there is joy in this painting, the light, the warmth. And now you see I'm going in and I'm adding these lines. And I think for me, I was thinking of, at first, like vines growing up the wall. But you see that as we go on here, they go from being vines to more being kind of cracks in the wall. And I go with that blending technique again of adding the heavy pigmented line, and then I'm going in with a small brush and water, and I blend it out a bit. And that starts to create the illusion of stone. And so I accidentally at this moment figure out how to take these tiles from being that chunky glass tile to a stone wall. And I didn't start this painting thinking I'm going to paint a stone wall today. I certainly wouldn't have felt confident going into it if I said I'm going to paint a stone wall. But the stone wall came to me. And now if I ever want to create a stone effect, I know how, because I let my intuition create random lines and random marks and played with them and didn't tell myself that I had to do something. Rather, I let myself do whatever came to me. And when I first started painting, if you told me you're just going to paint from your intuition with no plan, no subject, no nothing, I would have laughed in your face and said, yeah, right, no way. That's too stressful. I need more guidance. I need more structure. I need to know what to do. But through years of trial and error, through years of making bad art, through years of pushing myself through bad art, I have continuously surprised myself with what I am able to accomplish through that. And so for some people, the structure is great and wonderful, but you want to ask yourself, like, is the rigid structure, is always having a reference, is always, having a plan, maybe sometimes hindering my growth? Is it keeping me comfortable and safe, the word of the day? And that's okay. Maybe that's what you need at that time in your process. And so I don't think if I had told myself I had to go challenge myself right off the get-go and do what was harder, which was like doing intuitive art, I probably would have maybe had a harder time starting. But I started with what I was comfortable with, which was I actually started with watercolor mandalas. I really like creating mandalas, and mandalas are very symmetrical and everything's precise. And so that's where I started with this journey. And maybe I can find a old watercolor that I've done and clip it in here if I feel like it before uploading this. But I started really rigid, and I started really thinking I needed to create very literal things. And so just know that if the idea of being intuitive in your process scares you, that's a good thing. That's a good thing, because it's going to teach you, it's going to allow you to evolve, and it's going to push you past your comfort zone in a way that can only open up your creative process. You are the only thing that can get in the way of your creative process when it comes to, giving up. Of course, we have things that can get in the way, like chronic illness and life and responsibilities and stress and resources. But when it comes down to the effort and the motivation that you put into it, it really is up to you to allow yourself to keep going no matter what. And it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to do that when you're tired or you're sick or you're broke or you're stressed. But you can create with very minimal resources. You can create with a pen and a piece of paper. You can create paintings in your imagination. If you don't have any access to materials right now, you can paint in your imagination along with me, and watching these videos is learning. You can learn by watching, you can learn by doing. And so reminding yourself that creativity is possible and it's accessible to you, even in the depths of your imagination. And also knowing it's okay if you're blocked, and knowing it's okay if all you can do is watch painting, other people painting right now. That if you don't feel like it's your time or that you can, but understanding that at any moment that can change. And at any moment you can pick up a paintbrush or pick up a pencil and create. At this point in the piece, I'm starting to get afraid of it getting too muddy. So I do let some of it dry a bit, because the wet on wet at a certain point can start to look muddy. And it really can be of benefit to practice over and over and over again before you try to create exactly what I'm creating, if you haven't done this before, especially because this is so intuitive and I'm not really painting with any structure or technique here that is consistent. My editing jumped a little bit here, but I am not going to go back in and clip that at the moment, because then my time is going to change and I'm just not going to do that. So newbie mistake, is you're going to watch me paint these lines again for a second, but I did go in for just a moment and start to add in the tree line, and that's where I start to bring in that outdoor space. And so, even with this YouTube process for me, I am such a newbie with the YouTube. I'm such a newbie with long form content. Historically for me, for Instagram, long form content kept people away, and kept people from coming back. So I have always been afraid of doing long form content out of fear that it was going to make people not want to watch my content. And funny enough, a lot of comments came in last week that said they love my voice. And I've been getting those comments more and more over time. And I don't know if it's because I'm aging and my voice and the raspiness of my voice has started to really take over, but I used to get picked on and made fun of for my voice relentlessly, because I am from south of Boston. And so I had a very thick Boston accent most of my life, and I worked really, really hard to get rid of it the best I could in college, because in college I had several people, mostly men, tell me that I sounded trashy or I sounded uneducated. And as a 5-year Latin scholar, I was very offended by that. I didn't, when I say Latin scholar, I'm laughing at myself. That just came out way too casually. I was not a Latin scholar. I was in Latin for 5 years. So let's correct that. I think I got B's and C's. So let's be honest, Jess. What the heck? You ever do that where you catch yourself saying something, you're like, that wasn't honest. Wait a minute. And then you have to backtrack and be like, wait a minute. What I just said was not actually fully accurate. But it was a really tough time for me, because my voice was already picked on in high school, and then I get to college and they're like, not only is your voice awful, but your accent's awful too. So when I was bartending in college, I worked really hard on pronouncing my R's, pronouncing my A's, and I didn't always do that. I was a very much a park the car in Harvard Yard girl, and that saying park the car in Harvard Yard, my family would be like, park, they would make fun of the R, because I would come home and suddenly had a pronounced R, and they didn't get it. So hearing that comment is really nice. I just went on too far of a tangent with that. But anywho, trees. So here we start to bring the trees, and the courtyard feeling starts to really take effect. So I go in with the lighter, more translucent trees in the background, and the more solid, opaque trees in the foreground. The trees that are in the distance are going to be a bit more blurry and are going to be a bit more translucent and harder to see. And then the trees in the foreground are going to be a little darker. And that perspective can change. Sometimes what's further away you make a little darker. But for watercolor, it is more translucent, is a little further away. And because you can't build on a dark layer with watercolor unless you're using gouache. And at some point we are going to invite gouache into this relationship we have here with our intuitive watercolor process videos. But for now, that's what we're working with. So I'm creating the illusion of trees in the distance, and then trees in the foreground, and greenery in the foreground. And again, this was something that I got really good at over time and practicing. I used to just go in with my heavy layer right away, and then I wasn't able to build dimension in the piece. And so starting with more water, more translucence, and building it up with more pigment And you can allow the background trees to dry completely, or you can also allow some of that darker pigment to bleed into the still wet, more translucent trees, so it gets a bit more of a nice blend. It really just depends. Sometimes you want more of a structured layer, and sometimes you want more of a blend, and I'm just playing here, just playing. Now I'm bringing down some of that greenery onto the stone wall. Maybe it's some climbing vines or some climbing plants, but I want there to be a solid connection between the greenery above and this courtyard below. And my new favorite technique comes into play with putting down a dark layer of wet pigment and then blending it out with some clean water. I feel like it gives everything just kind of an airy effect and kind of almost like a dreamlike effect when it blends out like that into the rest of the painting. This is also helping build distance, and it's pushing the door or the archway further away because by darkening closer to what's further away, it creates the illusion that that is also further away. I think that makes sense the way I said that. But so this is helping with that feeling of walking towards something that is far away from you. And so what's far away from you is going to be a bit darker, a bit more blurry, and what's closer to you is going to be more in focus and more visible and more structured. And so I'm working on, again, creating that distance, creating that depth, and thinking a lot about where this is leading at this point. Like, what is this? Am I in a magic garden, a secret garden? Am I somewhere like in Central Park in the middle of a big city? I really wasn't sure. But I knew that I wanted to add something that really popped. And so gold leaf was what I immediately went to. So I'm using a gold leaf adhesive. This is just gold leaf adhesive from Amazon. Just Google gold leaf adhesive and you will find a bunch of different types, and I recommend just trying out a bunch of different types. I don't use this one specifically for any reason. It was just the one that was like available at the time that I ordered it. I did have one that I stuck with for a long time, but they actually don't make it anymore. So I am in the process of trying out new ones, and this one seems to be good. I don't see any issues with it so far. I'm using a tiny brush to create the illusion of birds, and that's really just like a little dash and a little arch dash and a little arch dash connected, a little really open M essentially, or it can be a really closed M. It kind of depends on the bird's positioning of their wings. But I put that down and then I allow the pigment to dry. And this part of the painting now is really about just subtle changes. I am in the moment of painting this, knowing that I am very close to being at least semi-finished. I had a feeling that it was likely that I was going to end up coming back and doing more to it later, but I wanted to be very meticulous about how far I went with these next steps because too much of a big gesture here might ruin the feeling that I had, and the feeling that I had was that I actually kind of liked it. And throughout the whole process, I had no idea, but these are the moments in the process where I was like, okay, I'm seeing this now. I'm getting it. I'm getting where we are. I can feel it. And I know that if I do something too bold, that I might take that feeling away and have to continue to work at it and fix it. And I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to be almost done at this point. And so at this point, I'm just going in and doing these finer little details, adding a bit more of some dark foliage over that more blended foliage that I added in the distance. And I'm adding now the gold leaf. And this is my favorite part. I go in with this is just a synthetic gold leaf foil from Amazon, and I will link that below. You want to make sure that you apply it and make sure it is nice and firm onto the adhesive. And you also don't want to apply it too soon because if your adhesive is still wet, then when you go to brush it away, you'll just brush away and have a gunky mess. So make sure you actually let it fully dry and use a soft makeup brush or a soft mop brush to wipe away the excess. And it can take a bit to do this, especially on this kind of textured paper. So just stay at it so that you can get all that excess off and get a nice refined foil. I can always do a separate video on the cold foil process if people are interested. I have a really hard time not adding a pop of gold to my paintings to make them feel complete. I find that final little touch of metallic, even if it's just the smallest little touch of metallic, just does it for me. It's the sparkly girl in me, I guess. I don't know, but I just love that gold feeling. And so sometimes I'll use a gold pigment. Sometimes I'll use a gold foil. Gold foil brings dimensionality as well because you can make the adhesive nice and thick. And so when it dries, it's a thick and it kind of comes out. It's like a three-dimensional bird. Like you can kind of actually see the bird no matter how you move the page. And I knew I needed a little bit more gold into this. And I immediately thought of the path and the yellow brick road and like a golden kind of energy coming from wherever it is that we're going beyond this door or portal. So using a really fine brush and going in and filling in some of the white space. But I didn't want to fill in all the white space. I was actually really nervous that this was going to ruin it. The whole time I'm like, please don't ruin it. Please don't ruin it. Please don't ruin it. So remember when you're watching these videos, you're seeing a lot of bold, confident movements, it seems like. And that's why I like talking you through this process, because I want you to know that not every movement, even if it looks confident, is confident. A lot of movements are, ooh, is this, yes, and so, or, ooh, no, So remember that what you see is not always what you get. And there really is no way to do this intuitive process wrong unless you're not doing it at all. So at this point in the talk, I am going to mention my dog, who we put down a couple of days after this painting, after a long battle with mast cell cancer. But I think it's important that I talk about this because that is what this painting was for. And I didn't even know it at the time of painting it. So as I'm painting this, my little dog is sitting next to me under my feet, as she always was. And she's been battling mast cell cancer for many years. We had her have 3 major tumors removed many years ago. And her little body, she was a little teacup Chihuahua. So she was like 5 or 6 pounds at her heaviest. And I know now that this was the portal. This was her way of saying, hey mom, I'm safe. Hey mom, I'm going somewhere good, because she passed away in my arms a few days later in the sunshine outside in my backyard in the middle of November on a 55, 57 degree day. Very rare in November, or used to be very rare in November here. She was my emotional support dog. Her name was Zoe, and she was everything. And I know now that this was her golden path to the Rainbow Bridge. And it just is a testament. I'm going to cry a little, maybe, possibly, so I apologize, but it is a testament to this intuitive process and how when we build confidence in ourselves and our ability to use art as a form of communication, things can come through us that we have no idea could possibly come through us. And I find so much comfort now in this painting because it is so different than anything I had ever done. And I had no idea why this was what was being presented to me at the moment. And now I know. And now I know that this is what some amateur version of whatever beauty she saw in those final moments. It was so warm. She was wrapped in a heated blanket and she was so good. She was such a good girl. She didn't suffer in the moment of death, and that was everything for me. And she did it at home. And so to not have to bring her to that clinical small space, she hated the vet. She hated the vet more than anything. And so to be able to provide that for her after her providing for me 13 years of love and unconditional support. We rescued her when she was 2 from a hoarder's apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment with 30-something other dogs that were all bigger than her. She was in a cage, a small cage in a small garage in a foster rescue when I got her. And so I had no idea. And so now you can go back and think about everything I talked about from beginning to end and in full honesty of where my thoughts and brain was as I painted it, and see how it was an exact process that reflected the journey of this dog's life and love and warmth. And she saw me through that portal, and that was the figure. I was the figure, and she was on the golden path. And I'm going to miss her every single day. And I am going to thank this process so much every single day for allowing me to channel things like this through a representational piece of art. I will never forget this painting, this process, what it felt like having her next to me through it and through life. In honor of my Zoe girl and all rescues out there, I ask that you please consider adopting adult dogs. They are the most unconditional love and support, and they need you.